They had built the day on a blade's edge and called it peace. The bells of the city were not ringing yet when Jon rode through the sour heat of King's Landing's outer streets. His gloved hand on the horse's reins and his eyes set in that tired, grim calm that came only when he had made his mind a wall. Smoke lay on the city like a veil. People hid behind shutters or peered through them. A butcher, apron-soaked, paused with his cleaver cocked above a haunch and watched the riders pass. The scrawl of rumor had outraced them. Dragons on the wind, unsullied ranks on the roads, a northern king who was not a king, a queen with hair like poured gold and a neck noose-tight in fate. Jon heard the city's weak heart in the distance. The clink of armor, the hushed scramble of feet. He could smell the salt of the bay. He could taste ash. "Your mind is set," Tyrion said beside him, hunched in his saddle, his face a white coin in the light. "It is," Jon said. "You could be killed for offering her mercy. So could we all." Jon's mouth felt dry. Mercy is not hers to grant or deny. "Then whose?" Tyrion asked, though he knew the answer. Jon looked up. A shadow crossed the sun as if an enormous hand had closed over it. Not cloud but wing. The dragon's cry rolled over the city, and people flinched at windows. On the parapets of the Red Keep men pointed with shaking spears and fixed their courage to the stone beneath their feet. "Mine," Jon said, softly, and he felt, like a cold thing sliding into his bones, the weight of a name he had never asked for and never wanted. The gates of the Red Keep stood open, and in the yard there were lines of Lannister men, ranks somewhat ragged, as if fear had chewed their edges. Jaime Lannister had already made his choice, and the choice had led him back here, to his sister and the home that had drowned them both again and again. Jon saw him now, standing with a handful of gold-cloaked guards who had lost their lions and learned to live with blankness. The stump under Jaime's sleeve made a shape like a closed question. "You asked for audience?" Jaime said when they dismounted. His mouth had a twist to it that might once have belonged to arrogance and had become something else, something smaller. "I thought you'd fly in." "I could," Jon said, and allowed himself a fleeting glance to the sky where Dany circled. "But I prefer my feet on stone when I talk about mercy." "You speak to a Lannister about mercy," Jaime said low. He flicked his eyes to Tyrion. "Our brother found some once, and it cost him dear." Tyrion's look said more than he would. "I paid and still pay. Take us to her," he said. "Or we can save ourselves the stroll and call the dragon down and ask the keep to make space in its cellars for more ash." Jaime hesitated, then turned and led them on. They went through corridors that smelled of lemon oil and damp masonry. Jon had never been here. His knowledge of the Red Keep had been borrowed from tales told in Winterfell snows, colored by the speaker's scorn. It surprised him that it looked like a place men had lived. A rush mat worn thin at a door where someone had stood thinking too long. A bronze sconce polished so bright it held at its center a little golden world where their faces bobbed like bruised fruits. They found Cersei Lannister in a hall open to a loggia. The city's red roofs scrolled out beneath them. She had not armored herself except in green silk and calm. Sun burned on her hair. Her belly was flat, and Jon wondered if the dragon had scorched that rumor out of her too. Beside her stood Qyburn, thin and watchful, and a ring of guards whose eyes kept tracking the sky rather than the men before them. The mountain loomed against a pillar off to her shoulder. He was heat and iron and a shaking in the air. "Brother?" Cersei said without looking at Tyrion. Then her gaze slid, took Jon in and cut. "Nephew, or is it cousin? Bastard? King?" "I lose track of the titles landsmen give themselves, as if water could be mother to stone." "Your Grace," Jon said. She laughed. "Even the wolf can dress his voice in courtesy. Don't bow. I know where you bend when dragons are overhead." Tyrion swallowed something bitter and let it slide back down. "We came to speak terms." "And the terms are surrender," Cersei said. "Yes, yes. You're late. The bells will ring if I command it. The gates will open. I will step down from the throne and you will, what? Place your silver-haired conqueror there and call it justice? They call my kind cruel, nephew, but at least I never lied about my hunger. You lied about everything else, Tyrion murmured. Cersei's eyes grazed him. And you told yourself you could save us all if you talked enough. We did what we were made to do. Jon felt the heat of the day press against his breastbone. He looked down over the Red City, the thatches, the crooked lanes, the stovepipe towers. He pictured them black. There are only so many piles of ash a man can look at before he loses track of what was built there. I will ask you for something you will not believe, he said very evenly. Cersei lifted the cup in her hand and took a sip without watching him. Ask then. I am entertained. Lay down your arms. Order your men to open the gates and drop the swords. Then kneel in the throne room and yield the crown and confess you have wronged the realm. Do it in words everyone can hear. A smile thin as a blade. You want me to do all of this in exchange for what? A public strangling? Your wolf's head trophy over the gates? An honest end. In exchange, Jon said, setting one gloved hand on the rail so that the sun made a white halo of it. For pardon. The word slid across the stone. Jaime made a sound breathless, involuntary. Tyrion closed his eyes. You're mad, Cersei said softly. The dragon's song in your ear, the snow in your blood. Mad, like your father by another name. Perhaps, Jon said, but hear it all the same. Now she watched him, as if the day had shifted its weight and she was testing the stability of the new balance. He could feel Dany's shadow pass again. He did not look up. You would pardon me, Cersei said, for the deaths of your kin, for Ned Stark's blood, for the war I fed, for the lies I lay down like roads, for driving a knife into your brother's war, for hunting your people like boars in the brush, for everything. For the realm, Jon said, not for you. Explain the difference. The realm deserves to stop bleeding, Jon said. It does not care what face sits a throne. It cares for bread, for quiet nights, for husbands who come home and daughters who do not vanish into passes and boys who keep their hands. It deserves a season of repair, not another season of burning. I would pardon the person who stands in the way of that, not because she deserves it, but because the realm does. Cersei considered the city like a cat considers a garden. And if I agree, you will let me walk away. You will never rule again, Jon said, as gently as one could deliver frost. You will go to Casterly Rock escorted to live out your life under guard. You will never command an army or mint coin or move men like stones on a board. Your house will swear fealty. You will be watched and counted, and you will be allowed to breathe until you stop. The realm will have your confession and your submission, and it's quiet. Cersei's fingers tapped the cup. She set it down so slowly that no sound came. You risk much with this theater, bastard. I risk more with fire, Jon said. Now the bells began, far off and thin, and they rolled across the city like a tired prayer. In the sky the dragon wheeled, dropping lower, a darker gloom across the sun. Cersei lifted her head like a woman listening to the sea. You forget my sister, your queen, she said, looking past him to the blue sear of air. She will take your pardon and chew it and spit it at my feet. She will bathe the city in righteousness. I will stand between her and the city, Jon said, and the words tasted of iron. I will make it hold. Cersei smiled without warmth. I would like to see that. Jaime stepped forward and bowed his head. Sister, he said, and the word was riven. Take the bargain. Her eyes flicked to him. You are not the one I asked for counsel. No, Tyrion said, stepping in as if he had been waiting his whole life to step into this moment. That would be me, and I say take it. Take it because our father would refuse it and die believing the stone could love him, and you are not him. Take it because if you do not, they will kill you and burn us all in the story they tell to themselves about justice. Take it because it is the last coin you can pay with that buys you anything that looks like life. She considered him. Something moved under the ice in her face, a carp that had outlived numerous winters. Jon held still. A gust of wind rattled the silk in the archway. The mountain shifted a fraction of a foot. Cersei said, Very well, we will do this dance. They made the walk together, the march of a funeral or a coronation. Down through the keep's wide throat into the great hall, where waiters had become witnesses and goldcloaks had become guests. Jon saw Lord Sallow with sleeplessness, women with knuckles gone white on their rosaries. A boy no older than Bran had been with his mouth open as if his teeth might catch history. The throne itself sat like a trap built of iron and ambition. The air smelled faintly of lilies and wine. Daenerys came through the air as a scream and landed on the terrace beyond with such grace that the stone itself seemed to yield to her. She entered the hall with Graf's pale blade. No, with nothing. Her weapons were eyes and a certainty so hot he could feel the heat of it from where he stood. People fell to their knees like dry wheat before a scythe. The Unsullied poured into the hall as a disciplined river behind her. Grey Worm's face might have been carved from the same iron as the throne. Daenerys looked at Cersei, and the look said, "I have walked through darkness and brought with me this light." She set her hand to her heart and then to her head, greeting the crowd like a queen from cities where queens were not myths. "It is done?" she asked Jon without turning. "It is," Jon said. She looked at him now, and for a moment he could see the woman who had crossed the sea because she believed the world owed it something better. The corner of her mouth softened. Then her gaze went to the Lannister queen, and the softness burned away. Cersei moved to the center of the hall. She did not kneel. She stood there with her jaw like a promise and said, loudly, clearly, "I have sinned against the realm by my pride and by my hunger. I took power and broke it across the backs of those who bent least. I killed and had killed and called it order. I confess it all to the realm. I yield my claim and my crown. I beg pardon of the realm." There was a hush so skinny a child could have snapped it. Jon felt the cords in his neck stand tight. He stepped into that gap and filled it with his voice. "The realm grants it," he said, "by my word and my name for peace." Daenerys drew a breath sharp enough to cut. "By whose right?" Her voice was low, but power moved through it the way the sea moves the hulls of ships. "By mine," Jon said. He held her gaze and did not let it break. "And by the right of those who have bled enough." "You promised me a better world," Daenerys said, and her eyes glimmered with all the cities she had left behind. "You promised me you stood for the broken. Is she one of them? Is this what you mean by breaking the wheel? Letting the spokes live another day to crush another back?" Jon's mouth opened and closed. He felt, with a clarity so harsh he almost laughed, that there were two women before him who had built themselves into explanations for the world. He was a man who could not live as an explanation. He could live as a choice. "If there's any world at all, it will be because we let one live," he said. "Not her. The city. Your mercy will cost you the love of the people who waited for justice," Grey Worm said, speaking the truth as he saw it, which was a soldier's truth, a tally. "They will still have roofs," Jon said. "And the men we lost?" Grey Worm asked. "They are not roofs. They are names," Jon said, and his voice went rough. "And they do not want more names to lie beside them." Daenerys looked at him a long time. She looked at Cersei, then at Tyrion, then at the 10,000 eyes that owned her or thought they did. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were not softer, but they were clearer. "Let the city hear it," she said. "Let them see if mercy can build. Let them see if roofs are enough. We will take her crown and her sword and her keys and send her west where her house will watch her until the watching is all there is. And God's help us if the peace you buy with this is false coin, Jon Snow." Jon bowed his head. "If it is, blame me." She smiled a little, something private and pained. "I will." The day broke into pieces then, the small, quick motions by which history turns. Grey Worm's men moving like a seamstress's hands to unpick the guards' blades from their belts. Qyburn standing very still, like a man negotiating with a sickness. The mountain looming uncertain, a tool in search of a command. Cersei removed the crown herself and set it on the stone like a ring she was returning to an old lover. Her face did not crack. Perhaps, Jon thought, because it had been ground down past the point where it could. Word ran through the streets like spilled wine. Peace, pardon, mercy. It worked. Not all believed it. Some believed and broke into sobs that emptied them. Women held each other. Men laughed in a way that sounded as if they feared their laughs would be stolen back. The bells kept ringing as if their ropes were in the hands of boys who did not know how to stop. When they brought Cersei out to the steps with the world watching, she paused a heartbeat, and 1,000 eyes looked for a twitch that would explain her. She gave them nothing but the lift of her chin and the vicious grace of a woman walking into her pen with her spine straight. After, when the hall had thinned and Daenerys had gone to speak to her captains and the men whose hands would measure the city and count its wounds, Jon found himself at a window and looked out toward the bay. The sun had made the water a scroll of beaten metal. Tyrion came to his shoulder, moved by habit to stand at the height of other men's hearts. "She will hate you," Tyrion said, "for a time, perhaps for a long time." "I know," Jon said. "You did not ask me what I think of your bargain." "You told me," Jon said. "You told her." Tyrion breathed out a short laugh. "I did. I always do. I do not always say the truth to myself while I am saying it to others. There is a ambition in my voice when I talk about peace, as if peace were my personal invention." Jon watched 3 gulls fighting over a silver scrap above the water. "What do you think now?" "That I am tired," Tyrion said, "and that you have bought the realm the only thing worth buying at time." He tapped the window sill, knitting his fingers afterward. "Now we have to decide what to do with it. Peace is not something a man holds. It is something he makes and remakes with his hands until they ache." That first week, the city had to be kept from tearing itself apart out of the raw joy of not dying. There were fights outside bakeries and feuds that had gone to ground and sprang up again. A priest of the Seven stood on a barrel preaching that mercy made the world too soft and was promptly knocked into the street by a fishwife who had lost 2 sons and refused to lose her temper too. Jon went among them. He was not a king. He could not be anything like one, not in the way that mattered to most. He was a man whose face now lived in 1,000 mouths, half curse, half prayer. They told him their grief as if he were a rain barrel, and he took it. He stood on a jetty and spoke with a man who had lost his wife and thought he might go out in a boat and not come back. And Jon said, "We still need fishermen." He helped an old woman pull her goat out from under a collapsed awning. He refused, twice. The sour wine a tavern keeper tried to press on him and took bread instead. In a burnt courtyard where 3 children were gathered around a cracked bowl, as if it might promise things, he crouched and asked their names. He couldn't give them their father back. He could give them a guard posted at their alley and a rationed pot of stew and a promise that someone would remember their names. And the realm watched the dragon on the walls, and the queen on the steps of her council chamber, and the northern man moving among them, and it tried to decide what to make of the picture. When Sansa came down from the north, she brought 20 wagons of grain and 24 men with ledgers for eyes. She did not embrace Jon in the yard, not while the world watched, but she pressed her fingers into his, the old Stark way, and he understood. Her hair was copper fire, and the sun made it a banner. Arya came 2 days later out of a ship that did not fly any colors and laughed when he tried to gather her into his arms because she was grown and too quick and did not like to be caught. She bit into an orange and made a face at the sweetness. "You made peace with lions," she said. "How dull." "Wait a week," he said. And she did, and watched a man try to kill him. They had known it would come. Mercy is a heresy. It asks a man to put down his beautiful hatred. A narrow-faced cobbler slipped a blade into his sleeve and stood in a crowd that had gathered to hear the Queen's pronouncement about rebuilding the city's cisterns. Jon felt the eyes on him the moment before Ey moved, felt the old animal sense stir in his belly. He turned, too slow to catch the arm, and saw only the gleam. Arya's hand took the man's wrist in the next heartbeat and bent it until the knife fell. She tucked her body into his and whispered something that paused him whole, the way a song will sometimes stop a hastening mind. The men who would have thrown him to the paving stones threw him to his knees and bound him. "Let me judge him," Grey Worm said afterward in the council chamber. "He would have killed you. It is war still in men like him." "It is," Jon said. "But I will not hold a court whose sentence is the same for every case. Let him sit in a cell and hear the city live. Perhaps it will make a crack in the thing that hardened inside him." Grey Worm did not understand it, not as a soldier. He understood orders. He gave them crisp as a line. Daenerys understood and did not, both at once. She walked the chamber as if her feet needed to measure the distances between the pieces on her board. "We cannot be weak," she said. "If we are weak, the old powers will test every wall." "We are not weak," Sansa said, and her voice was Winterfell as much as her face. "We can build a gallows and a granary. We can choose which one to fill first." She looked at Jon then. He looked back. "But you cannot offer mercy like bread and not bake enough of it. People will call it yours. They will call it your creed. If you fail at it once, they will say the faith is false." "I know," Jon said. "I won't fail." He did not let the exhaustion sit on his face. He did not let them see that his bones wished to lie down in the river like logs. Jaime Lannister asked to see him, and Jon went to the room where they kept him, which was comfortable as a man's winter cell can be. Bed, chair, a narrow window with a slice of sea. Jaime sat with his stump on the table, as if it were an old friend, and looked at it as Jon came in. "Do you mean it?" Jaime said without greeting. "Peace." "Yes," Jon said. Jaime nodded, as if he had set some private wager on the answer. "I did not think she would take it. There's a pride in her that is a religion. I thought she'd go to the block and outstare everyone on the steps. I do not know why she took it. I don't know that she knows. She did it to spite someone," Jon said. "Perhaps me. Perhaps the story people wanted. Perhaps herself. She did many things for spite," Jaime said, and the admission had the rough corners of honesty. "And some for love. It's a muddle. You'll hear songs made of it that are cleaner than it was." "I don't care about songs," Jon said. "You should," Jaime said, lifting his eyes at last. "They last longer than granaries. They decide who becomes a god in the market of memory." "I don't want to be a god," Jon said. "You don't get to choose," Jaime said. "You chose this. The rest will be chosen for you." He shifted, tilted his head. "Can I ask something?" "You may. When I stood in a burning hall with a king's blood on my hands, I did it for peace," Jaime said. His jaw worked. "They called me a lot of things. None of them were the name I had given the act. Someday, when this bargain you've made has grown old and people are telling stories about it in warm beds to lovers they don't know how to keep, what would you want them to call you?" Jon thought. He had never been good at wanting titles. He had wanted things that did not cast shadows on the ground. Warmth, wordlessness. A father who was not made of duty and a mother who was not a secret. He looked at Jaime's stump, at the evidence of a cost paid, and said, "A builder." Jaime laughed, short and surprised. "A builder. Gods keep you then, builder." They took Cersei to the rock at month's end. She went by sea because the roads were not safe for a procession like that. The roads would not be safe for a long time, not for anyone whose face had been on a coin. Tyrion went with her. Daenerys said it was foolish. Sansa said it was necessary. Jon said nothing until Tyrion came to him alone at dusk the day before and stood in the doorway with a look like a man who had finished a book he thought would be longer. "I have to see it through," Tyrion said. "We are all hostages to our choices, but I choose to be a hostage who can count the chains." "Be careful," Jon said. "I am always careful," Tyrion said. "It never helps." At the quay, as the ship made itself ready, Cersei stood on the deck and looked at the city as if she were engraving it on her eyes. "I birthed you," she said under her breath. "I fed you. You tried to guard me. I am older than you, and I will outlive you in ways you cannot imagine." She did not wave. The ship pulled away. Tyrion stood beside her and did not wave either. Daenerys stood a little apart on the stones and watched with her face set to a meaning only she had the code for. When Jon came to her, she did not turn. "I did not think you would hold me to it," she said. "You would have held me to my word," Jon said. "Yes," she said. "I would have." She looked at him. You are not a king, you tell me. You will not be. But you make decrees now and call them bread and say they feed everyone. Men like you love to call decisions a kind of weather. He swallowed. What would you have me be? Honest, she said. If not to them, then to yourself. That is rarer than kingship. He nodded. And you? Something other than a conqueror, she said. It is a difficult costume to take off. It wants to cling. Help me take it off. Her mouth tilted, not quite a smile. And we will see if peace wants me as much as war did. The first winter storm came early and hit King's Landing like a wet slap, and the people cursed the skies and then Jon for lack of foresight and then the gods for not making foresight a thing a man could bake. He stood in the granary with ledgers that Sansa's men loved like wives and did the arithmetic that sends men to bed early. How to make grain stretch, how to ache need bend to the size of bags, how many mouths could be fed without sending every horse to the stew pot. He signed orders with a hand that did not want to hold a quill and felt, for the first time, something that was not dread but that the world would call hope. There were enough sacks stacked to see them through if nothing else cracked. The city changed almost despite itself. A team of masons began to love a particular intersection where the stones had been laid smartly. A troop of children began to run messages through alleys and developed a rivalry with the older boys who had done it before. A baker invented a loaf he called the Queen's Pardon, made with raisins and a ridiculous dusting of sugar that stuck to beards and made hard men look foolish, and the line for it bent around the lane. An old septon began to say a prayer that thanked the mother not only for mercy but for the decision to offer it. He said it awkwardly at first, as if he were trying on shoes that pinched. Arya left and returned and left again, like weather. She would show up in the morning and say, mouth full of pastry, that some lord out past Maidenpool had decided he did not like the concept of taxes without the pleasure of drafting their amount and had to be educated by a gentle touch on the windpipe. Jon would not ask questions that would make her lie. He would kiss the top of her head when he could catch it. She would duck away, laughing, and vanish into a crowd. Sansa set a council to keep the city honest about its own breath. She had a way of arranging men and women around a table so that the ones who lied could hear themselves do it. They began to compile lists of prices not as commands but as signs. When the price of eggs rose in one ward and not in another, she sent someone to ask where the hens had been frightened. It embarrassed the men who wanted to look only at armies. Grey Worm trained boys who had never held a spear how to stand straight. He taught them not to look at their feet when they marched. He taught them how to see the edges of a crowd before the crowd knew it was a crowd. He slept badly. He woke at sounds that were only bells and did not distinguish them from others until he was fully sitting with his hand stretched toward a sword that was not there. He began to take walks along the walls at night and nodded to Jon when he passed him, which was often, and they said little, soldiers who had run out of words they trusted and relied instead on the fact that other men occupied the same dark. Daenerys went to Dragonstone sometimes. She said the air there cleared her mind. She flew out over the sea and then returned with salt on her cheeks and something cattle might recognize as peace in her shoulders. When she was in the city, she held court in the mornings and listened to complaints. A glassmaker who had been ruined 3 times demanded compensation as if the world were a coin that had to be fair. A woman with a baby at breast asked for different work because the tanning vats had taken her milk and turned it sour. A man asked if he could marry another man and have it written down as a thing the city would protect. Daenerys asked Jon to sit in a chair to her right and say what he thought. He said again and again, "Give them space to live," and they tried. News came from the Rock. Cersei walked the clifftop paths like a wraith and did not speak for weeks, then had days when she spoke to everyone and demanded accounts and inventories and tried to take the shape of power from the shape of rule and failed. She drank less than rumor wished. She acquired a gardening habit and tore handfuls of herbs out of their beds when something in her vision offended her. She did not try to escape. Where would she go? She had already escaped something and found the room she had entered was smaller than she had allowed herself to imagine. One evening, Tyrion came back. The city met him like a friend who had done a difficult errand and seemed older for it. He found Jon on the wall, watching the boats make their slow lines on the water and trying to understand whether the men on them were happy. "How is she?" Jon asked. Like a winter fruit, Tyrion said. Hard, perfect, tasteless, full of memory of sweetness. And you, like a summer one, he said. Overripe, easily bruised, drunk on the fact of being alive. He leaned his elbows on the parapet. She will not be a symbol. I forgot that is the one thing she has always been good at refusing. She will be a person until she dies, and then they will make her into something she would despise. Jon grunted. We all get that in the end. Except you, Tyrion said. You are trying to be a builder. He patted Jon's arm. Keep trying. It annoys everyone. They were interrupted by a woman who ran up the steps like a thought that had to be said, breath burning in her throat. My lord, she gasped at Jon. Your grace, they say it's the river gate, the old watchtower. Someone's lit it. They ran. The old tower was a stack of knotted stone with a wooden cap that made it look like a man in a stupid hat. It was burning flamboyantly. Grey Worm already had men forming lines to the cistern, buckets of frantic metronome. The fire caught the tower's hat, then the brim, then jumped as if it had learned a trick. It licked the edge of a tenement roof and began to purr. Clear the houses, Jon shouted. Daenerys did the job no one else could. She sent the dragon up like an argument against catastrophe and had it beat its wings in great, deliberate thuds that pushed the flames back and sent sparks skyward where they died of loneliness. Rain of ash fell into men's hair. A child screamed because he had never been so close to a wing and could not make himself believe the world would not be crushed by it. The men at the cistern line made their arms into a single arm, water flowing into water, and the fire grumbled and sank. When it was done, the tower was a black tooth. In the smoke, 3 men tried to run. Arya appeared as if she had not left Jon's side and took the one with the lantern by the ankle, and he went down like a sack of grain. Grey Worm's men brought the others to the square where Daenerys was standing with soot on her cheek. She looked like a painting of a queen done by a man who had never seen one and guessed. Handsome, fierce, wrong in the small details. The men were tired in the way that makes truth easy to speak. Why? Daenerys asked. The Lantern Man looked at Jon as if addressing the only person who might understand. Because you made us forget, he said. We were supposed to remember. There was supposed to be justice. My brother died for a loaf of bread stolen when your men broke the market. And she, the lion she walks. You made me forget I wanted her dead. He spat. I want to remember. Jon stood very still. He thought painfully of the men at the wall, of oaths and cold, of how memory works like a knife for some men and like a salve for others. He walked up to the man. What is your brother's name? The man blinked. The question took his breath away. Tomas, he said, as if someone had asked him to fetch it from a shelf he could not reach and found he could. He was quick with his hands. He could make a pocket go light and you'd think you had lost something and then he'd laugh and put it back. How old? Jon asked. 17. Who killed him? The man's mouth opened and closed. The heat pressed on them all. A soldier did, Jon said, in a city that was coming apart. A soldier who will never be tried because there were 10,000 like him and he has a foot in a grave in some other place with a name you do not know. You did not set this fire for your brother. You set it because your anger needed a place to live. I am not telling you to put it out. Keep it. It is yours. But do not feed it houses. Feed it by keeping your city. Feed it by outliving this. I granted a pardon, and for that you hate me. Keep hating me, but help me fetch water next time. The man stared at him as if this answer were a trick. Then he looked at the black tooth of the tower and the ash on his shoes and the child who had stopped screaming and was hiccuping and the queen with soot on her cheek and found, in that mixture, his anger's new home. He bowed his head a fraction. We need more cisterns, he said. We do, Sansa said from behind them, as if she had organized the line herself. And fewer wooden hats. They wrote laws that winter that made men grumble because good laws always do. They forbade collective punishments and repealed levies that had been used as hiding places for theft and established a court for the small. People whose houses had been burned by active war could lay claim to timber, to slate, to a day's labor mandated by the crown. They wrote, in crabbed script and sharp black ink, the right for a man to stand before a court and ask why he had been held and have the court answer in a voice the people could hear. They made a measure of mercy a matter of process instead of whim. It was tedious. It was slow. It was how buildings do not fall down. The spring brought colors back to the river in a way John had not realized he had missed. He found himself one morning in a market listening to a woman sing about a girl who had fallen in love with a boy who made barrels, and then with the barrel he had made, and only later discovered those were the same thing. He laughed, and a boy hawking apples turned, surprised and pleased, as if he had caused the laugh. In the afternoon, John walked the wall and saw new shingles on roofs where there had been holes and a new child in a window. He thought, like a man noticing he had grown slightly taller without effort, that the day had not asked him to choose between fire and ash. It had asked him for the smaller heroism of staying with his choice. He dreamed often of the hall, of Cersei's voice confessing, of Daenerys's eyes, of bells that would not stop. In the dream he said the words over again, and sometimes they were different. I grant you pardon. The realm does. No one does. There is no such thing as pardon for what has been done. There is only work. He woke in a sweat and lay on his back and watched the ceiling and counted breaths and did not name his God. On a day when the wind came off the sea and tasted of iron, Daenerys asked him to ride with her to the fields beyond the city where the first new canal cut brown through the earth. She wore plain clothes. He wore a plain face. They stood at the bank and looked at the water that had been commanded into a narrow bed. Men directed it with shovels. A pair of girls tossed pebbles at each other and laughed and missed and laughed again. It seemed impossible that everything depended on these small motions. I burned cities in my mind when I was a child, Daenerys said, watching the water show its teeth and then smooth. Not because I wanted ruin for its own sake, but because I wanted to clear ground. I thought if you burned enough, the world would stop being what it was. And now I think the world will always be what it is, she said. And we are only lucky to have fields this year and canals this month and a man who said a word in a hall at the right time. She looked at him. I do not forgive you for making me keep my word. I did not ask you to, John said. No, she said. You never ask for anything you cannot lift yourself. She stepped closer. If I asked you to leave with me and build something without thrones and courts and ledgers, would you come? He looked at her. His heart did what hearts do when offered a path through a wood. He saw himself on a shoreline with no banners, on a small farm with a fence to mend, on a hillside watching sheep with a dog that loved him because it had no idea what he had done. He wanted all of that with a longing that was a wound. He put it in the pocket where longing belongs. No, he said, NSH. He smiled as if the word had a beauty to it. You are the only honest man in this city, she said. That is not true, he said. There is a boy who sells apples who is very honest. She laughed. He did not mean to make her. He was glad he had. The years made a body around the day of the pardon. The city grew back a skin. It forgot some of its scars and traced others with careful fingers. Songs were written that lied prettily. Some called Jon Snow the Beggar King, who gave away everything he could have claimed. Some called Daenerys the Tempered, who learned to love the thing she had wanted to destroy. Some called Cersei the Confessor, a title that would have amused her if titles had ever amused her. She died at Casterly Rock one chill morning with sprigs of rosemary under her pillow. After a day spent in the garden where she had once ripped the plants like enemies and now parted them with fingers that had learned a new patience. Tyrion was with her. He sent word on a single sheet. She is dead. The sea looked cold. I am undone and not undone. When Jon read it, he felt something leave him that he had not known he carried. A small, hard knot, the size of a thumb. He did not feel lighter. He felt less arranged around a point. He walked down into the city. He bought a loaf of the Queen's pardon for no reason but that he wanted the sugar to dust his lip. He stopped at the market and let the girl throw a pebble at his shoulder and feign shock that she had struck him with such accuracy. He stood on a bridge and looked at the water, brown and green and gold, and understood that he would never know if he had done the right thing. He would only know that he had done a true thing, at least at the time and at least with the heart he had. That is all men are allowed. On the way back to the keep, he met Arya dancing along a low wall like a cat with too much grace. She jumped down and matched his stride. "You look like you put something down," she said. "I did," he said. "Good," she said, flicking his sleeve with 2 fingers. "You were walking crooked." They went up together, past the guard who had learned to stop saluting everyone, into the cool corridors that smelled of lemon and chalk and paper. They passed Sansa's men, bent over their ledgers. They passed Grey Worm, who nodded and did not pretend he knew what rest was. They passed Daenerys in a doorway, backlit by light that made her hair into a sea the sun could drown in. She said, "We keep building." He said, "We do." And the realm, which had been counted and named and asked what it wanted until it had begun to have an answer, set down the stones and lifted the beams and pulled the ropes and listened to the bells ring for births and weddings and the small, daily miracles of not dying. The dragon flew fewer circles over the city and more over the fields, testing the currents there. The apples ripened and were eaten and turned into stories by the winter fires. When winter came, the granaries did not fail. When spring came, the river was kind. When summer came, a boy who had once tried to burn a tower carried water in both hands and spilled none of it. No one was satisfied. Everyone was alive. It was perhaps enough. On a night when the moon hung over the bay like a coin found by a poor man and held to the light, Jon sat in the garden that Daenerys had made from a courtyard that had once held nothing but soldiers and listened to the sea fold itself and unfold itself again. He felt the wind and did not think to ask it a question. He closed his eyes and opened them and saw nothing had changed and everything had. He stood and went inside and slept and dreamed of your ordinary day. Bread and water and work and the knowledge that morning will come, which is the only mercy anyone is allowed to grant and keep. And somewhere, far from courts and halls, in a farm that had been built after a fire that had burned and a boy who had not died learned to make barrels that did not leak, a woman told her daughter a story about a man who pardoned a queen because he wanted roofs more than heads. The daughter asked if the queen deserved it. The mother said no. The daughter asked if the man did. The mother said no. The daughter frowned. Then the mother broke a loaf of bread and gave her a piece and said, "This is what we got for it." The girl ate and said, "It's sweet." The mother smiled and said, "There was sugar that year." By the time the girl had grown, the story had hardened and softened in the correct places and become something men could die for if they wanted, though none of it asked them to. Jon Snow grew older with his knees. Daenerys learned to speak more softly without feeling smaller. Sansa counted more slowly. Arya came and went, and each time she came, she had a new scar that she did not name and a new laugh that she lent to people who needed it. Grey Worm found a way to sleep. Tyrion learned to drink and stop before starting. The bells rang sometimes wrong and sometimes right. The dragon learned the taste of wind that lifted the smell of grain. The city forgot and then remembered and then forgot again and then stubbornly remembered once more that peace is a job and not a prize. And in the quiet that followed the remembering, you could sometimes hear a man with a northern voice speaking a small thing that had made itself into a creed. Not for her, for the realm, not because she deserved it, because we did. And the realm, ornery and hungry and wearing a new scar on its chin, nodded and went back to work. The sea wore the moon down over and over until it was a thin coin and then a fat one again, and no one asked the tides to swear fealty. The city learned the trick of living without waking at every shout. People argued about prices and neighbors instead of banners. They forgot how to fear their own footsteps in the dark. Peace, like any living thing, grew its own pests and its own flowering. Jon found himself counting boats again, a quiet liturgy of arrivals and departures. He knew the names of captains whose voices he had never heard. He knew how their ships leaned when laden with timber from the Blackwater to repair rooflines in Flea Bottom, and how they rode light when they brought grain north from the Mander. He went sometimes to the piers at dawn and watched men set poles under heavy crates, watched the little ritual of a ship leaving. Lines cast off, a boy running to jump the gap, a woman calling after him not to be a fool and then smiling when he was. Ghost came south as if he had always intended to, padding into the courtyard one gray morning with burrs stuck in his fur and the particular look of a creature who had discovered that he missed someone and could not explain it to himself. The unsullied in the yard stiffened and then pretended, almost convincingly, that they had not. The city made a path for him because his eyes made paths. John knelt and pressed his face into the great white ruff and breathed in pine and snow and a hint of the road. Ghost huffed, affronted and pleased, and leaned his weight into John's shoulder as if pushing him back into a shape he preferred. "You've brought the North with you," Tyrion said, appearing with a pear he did not intend to eat. "The kitchens will need to double their meat." "He hunts," John said, straightening, his hands still buried in fur. "He remembers how." "So do you," Tyrion said. "Unfortunately for all our ledgers." They spoke then of things that were not wolves. The Iron Bank had sent a letter that read like a smile. They wished to speak about arrears and futures. They had never been fond of surprises, and a pardon is a rearrangement of risk. The Reach had flower and stubbornness both, and its lords had begun to weigh whether to send one without the other. Dorne, still nursing old pride like a cat with a good scar, had made murmuring noises that could be read as friendliness from far away and offense up close. The Vale, cushioned by mountains and soft high air, had discovered that the world had not ended and decided that therefore it never would. "We need a ship and a tongue and a man who knows how to look nervous at all the right moments," Tyrion said, biting the pear at last and frowning at its sweetness as if insulted. "For Bravos." "Davos," John said, as if the name were a coin found under a chair exactly when one needed it. "Of course," Tyrion said. "He can appear as honest as a window and is twice as useful. He will tell them the truth, and then the truth will break into all the helpful pieces." Davos came the next day from the driftmark roads, boots stained with salt, eyes creased at the corners in that familiar way that made men think of harbors and things that lasted. He listened to the list of sums and the list of fears, and when Tyrion finished, he scratched under his beard and said, "The bank wishes to be repaid on time and repaid forever. We'll give them both and make them believe it was their idea. I'll take a clerk who can write small and a cook who can make fish less like itself. And a girl who can count faster than any Bravosi if you've one about." "We have 3, Sansa said, appearing in the doorway with ink on her thumb and the air of a woman who would like the world to be finely grained so she could sort it correctly. "You may have one if you return her unspoiled by their manners." Davos bowed. "I will protect her from politeness." Brienne of Tarth arrived with rain on her shoulder plates and a news that was less message than presence. The Riverlands were quieting. Men who had once needed to live by violence were remembering trades that had more to do with the hands than the knife. She visited Jaime in the stone tower where he was allowed to live with the sort of comfort that looked, to the right eye, like a different shape of confinement. She told him of a boy at the ford who had learned to shoe a horse so well the beast had leaned into him the way Ghost leaned into John, and Jaime had smiled and then not smiled, and Brienne had watched both. "You could come with me," she said to him one night, not for the first time, the rain drumming on the arrow slits with the obstinacy of small fingers. "There are places where your name is only a story and stories are easily corrected by work. I tried to correct a story once," he said, looking down at his hand that was not a hand. "It grew back stronger in the telling." He looked up. "But I will come, not to correct anything, to hear hammers. I find I sleep better when there are hammers." They left the city at dawn, 2 figures under a sky that remembered to be blue. People looked up from their tasks and did not flinch, which was a kind of victory. John watched them go and felt a little less necessary for the first time in months and thought it might be good to practice that. Daenerys watched too. She had learned stillness in a way that frightened people who did not understand that it was a hard-won thing, that once she had been all motion, all flame. She came to John later with a ledger under her arm that looked offensive in its ordinariness. "Storm's End," she said. "I have a thought that is more like a stone in my shoe than a plan. Gendry Waters has repaired more boats than anyone who ever wore yellow hair. He is Baratheon no matter the letters. The Stormlands want a face they recognize that is not mine. I will make him lord and watch how the wind moves." "Do it," Jon said. "He will build piers and call them honor, and men will laugh and then find they are standing on them anyway." He hesitated. He asked Arya to be his wife once. Daenerys's mouth curved. Did she laugh? "She smiled without smiling," Jon said. "She told him she did not want to be a lady. She wanted roads. He wanted walls." "Both are useful," Daenerys said, "but not for the same person. I will send him a raven. He will run to the door and forget to be solemn when he answers it." Gendry did as predicted. He forgot tea. "Oh, be solemn all the way to Storm's End." He took the heavy letters and the heavy signet and put them in a pocket like stones, and then he went to the yard and found his hammer and tried its weight and smiled because some weights a man chooses. He set men to scraping moss from the Great Wall and women to counting barrels and boys to hauling sand from the beach where it had no business being. He did not speak often about kings or oaths. He spoke about roofs and boats and a grain store under the West Tower that would not flood and a gate that would close without complaint. The folk there began to call him Lord as if the word were a joke that had become a habit and then a fact. The Iron Islands tested the edges of this new quiet as a man tests the edge of a blade with his thumb. Some reavers, not with Yara's leave but buoyed by the habit of being ugly, took 2 ships out and came home with plunder they could not clean properly. Yara sent them to King's Landing with their hands tied and their faces hard and said to Daenerys in a voice like the sea when it has no patience, "No one will accuse me of forgetting whose house I keep. I will not have you send me a dragon to teach me manners when I have already taught them to myself." "You taught them well," Daenerys said, and the Unsullied took the men to labor on the river wall, and the city learned a new view of justice. That sometimes it came wearing the faces of those who had often held its opposite. Dorne sent a delegation made of silk and knives, and Sansa set a table for them with oranges and a pitcher of water in which rosemary floated like little green snakes. The new prince, a thoughtful man with the sort of profile that makes poets behave badly, said, "We have no interest in flags that do not shade us, but we share an interest in markets that do not cheat and roads that do not stop at swords. Make us a treaty that does not stain, and we will sign it as if it were a dance." "You'll forgive me if I prefer contracts to dancing," Sansa said gently, and they forgave her because her voice made men believe in things like scales and level beams. By the week's end the treaty existed. Dorne would send salt, citrus, and oil. King's Landing would send timber, iron tools, and new songs. There would be a court at Sunspear for disputes, and a court in the capital for the same, and neither would pretend the other was not a real thing. The prince left with a little smile, as if pleased by having been handled exactly. The Iron Bank shook its head and then nodded in the same letter. Davos returned with a girl of 14 who could do sums faster in her head than most men could with a chalkboard and who regarded the world with the cool curiosity of someone who had already rebuilt 2 lives and intended to build more. "They lent us enough and no more," Davos said. "They asked for an accounting that would make even your lady sister sweat, your grace. I showed them the grain in its sacks instead of the numbers on their paper, and I think they believed me for a moment." "They believed the sacks," Sansa said. "Numbers are sacks with better posture." Daenerys watched this, all of it, with her hands folded and her jaw set to a task. She had the dragon fly farther each week, not circling the city like a hawk but ranging along the rivers and over the marshes and across the farms where boys pointed and fell backward in the grass to watch the brief eclipse. She stood sometimes in the granary, where she had once stood in a throne room, and listened to men argue about weights and measurements with the same passion they had once reserved for crowns. It soothed some part of her that had been scorched to uselessness, could not soothe all of it. There were nights when she woke with her teeth set against a scream and no one to wake but herself. Jon learned to know the set to her mouth that meant she had flown in her sleep and burned a city she could not name and woken sick with jasper smoke. He would sit with her in the garden and let the night settle around their shoulders and say nothing. "I was a storm," she said one of those nights, not looking at him. "I loved being one. I loved the way men's voices changed when they said my name. I loved the smell of fear and the taste of triumph and the size of the story. I have put that away." You have put it somewhere you can reach it, Jon said. Yes, she said. If I am honest. She smiled a little in the dark. You ask honesty of me. I return the favor. What have you put away that you would like to lift again? He thought of the north. He thought of Winterfell's gray walls and the way the cold there is not air but a person. He thought of riding between pines with no banner and no errand. He thought of a child's laugh he had never heard and a hand he had not held because his life had not left room for it. He did not say any of that because talking about wanting is a way to make it brittle. I have put away the thought that everything can be mended if I suffer enough, he said at last. It is the thought that kept me walking when my legs wanted to be logs. It is also a vanity. The world mends or it doesn't. I can help. I am not a god. That is why people will trust you, she said, and why you will disappoint them. A raven came from Winterfell with handwriting he could have recognized from across a field. Sansa's neat, uncompromising lines, and a second message written in a stop-and-start hand that was really not a hand anymore at all and yet somehow was Bran's. The North wanted acknowledgement of what it had already become. It had fought, it had knelt, it had risen. It had lived through a winter whose teeth would never stop aching. It wanted not quite independence, not quite a crown, something colder and truer. A clause in the world that said it would not be forced to forget what it was. Jon took the letters to Daenerys and laid them on the table next to the ledger she had been reading. She did not touch them. Immediately, she watched his face instead. I will not ask you to argue against it, she said. I would not, he said, and I know what it asks of you. It asks me to be a queen of less, she said. It asks me to step down from a map I was told belonged to me if I could take it. She lifted the letters then. The North is not a doctrine. It is a weather. Men die of ignoring it. Men live by respecting it. She read. She folded the paper with care. Very well. We will write it into law. The North will be bound by treaty and blood and memory, and not by quills alone. Sansa will guard it as if it were a child. You will go there and stand with her when the right words are spoken. I will go, he said, and Ghost lifted his head as if he understood a word he liked. He went north with a small escort and a large sense of relief, like a man undoing a belt after too large a meal and finding that he could breathe again. The land changed as he rode. The green thinned, the sky widened, the stones became the sort that remember snow even in summer. He slept one night at an inn where a girl sang a song about the Queen's pardon, and then a rude one about the Queen's lover which made the rafters shake with laughter. He flushed and then laughed too. He stayed one night in a farmhouse where a woman had 3 sons who took turns asking him if Ghost ate children, and he told them no, not unless they were particularly badly behaved, and even then only those who stole bread from each other. He crossed the neck with its fog like an old man's beard and felt his heart become the sort of quiet that comes from the right cold. Winterfell rose out of the ground like a thought that had turned into stone. Sansa met him at the gate and pressed her forehead to his for a heartbeat, the Stark's true greeting. She smelled of wool and ink and the faintest trace of smoke that is not from war but habitude. Bran waited in the yard, eyes far away and exactly present. He smiled with more of the boy in it than Jon had seen in years. You did something only someone who didn't want power could do, Bran said mildly when they were in the hall and had set their hands around bowls of stew whose steam made the air friendlier. You let the story be about something other than your name. I'm tired of being a story, Jon said. It's not interested in whether you are tired, Bran said, not unkindly. But it can be taught manners. You've done that. Sansa is better at it. Sansa rolled her eyes in a way that made her look exactly like a girl for a heartbeat. You give me all the work and then praise me for doing it. It's a clever trick. She sobered. It was the only way that did not risk us all, Jon. You know it. Mercy brought costs, but not the kind that would have salted fields for a generation. They wrote the words that would hold the North in the shape it had chosen. They wrote them with more care than any poem had ever been written and more ferocity than any war letter. The North would defend the realm when called, and the realm would respect the North's solitude when not. The wardenship would remain with House Stark while its blood ran true, and if it did not, the lords would choose without swords. The old gods would not be mocked, nor the new compelled. Trade would be counted in standards both could read. Criminals crossing borders would be judged where they had offended unless both courts agreed otherwise. It was dull and holy work. It made Jon sleep well and wake with sand in his eyes that was not sand but a sense of rightness. Arya appeared with snow in her hair, as if it had been waiting to crown her the moment she crossed the barrows. She ate an apple in 3 bites and declared she hated apples, then grinned and went to find the boys who had asked about ghosts to teach them the difference between being quick and being clever. She refused to stay in a room with a door that locked and slept in the great hall like a soldier. At dawn, Jon found her standing on the battlements staring west with the look he had learned meant that her feet were already there. "When it's done," she said without turning, "I'll go. I meant it when I said I wanted roads more than rooms." "They'll miss you," he said. "They always do," she said, a little sad and a little proud. "You know how to tell a city you are leaving and make it feel bigger for the fact." He wanted to ask her to stay anyway. He did not. He had learned a few manners too. The ceremony was simple because there was no taste for grandeur. Men who had once fought each other stood in the yard and held their tongues because words would have made it sentimental. The heart tree watched with its terrible kindness. Sansa spoke the words that put Winterfell and the North into the shape they had chosen. Jon stood beside her and did not say anything because the things he could have said belonged to a different time. Bran's eyes closed and opened and held something in them that made the air feel thick like summer. Approval from a place where approval has more weight than any crown. When it was done, the people did not cheer as if after a victory. They breathed as if after a rescue. He stayed a week. He went to the crypts. He stood in front of the faces that had made his face and let the silence of the dead do whatever work it intended. He knelt and thanked them for the things they had given him and forgave them for the things they had not. He put his palm to the stone wolf at the foot of Lyanna's effigy and thought of a different life that had never been possible and somehow had always been true. A life where names were less important than fires and where a boy became a man by carrying water rather than by carrying a sword. Ghost slept beside him with the contentment of a creature who knows where his person is. On the 8th day, he rode south again. Sansa watched him go from the wall with her hand on Bran's chair and her jaw set to a line that would hold. Arya walked with him for an hour and Dee then cut off toward the river with a wave that was both goodbye and more like a promise. "I'll send you something interesting." He crossed the neck under a sky that had decided to rain only when it felt like apologizing. He slept one night at the same farmhouse, where the boy who had asked about Ghost had grown an inch and now asked about swords and received a lecture about hoes. He smiled all the way to the Rose Road, which seemed like a magic trick. King's Landing smelled different when he returned, which is to say it smelled the same, but he had been away and so noticed everything. Cinnamon from the quay where a Braavosi ship had unloaded barrels from far markets. Lime from the river wall where men were slapping mortar into gaps with the contentment of men who feel they are making something that will last longer than their knees. A trace of char that never quite left, the city's thin shadow of itself. Daenerys stood on the steps of the council chamber with a cup she did not drink from and a smile that was not for anyone watching. When he reached her, she lifted the cup in salute and then set it aside and put her palm to his cheek and left it there longer than was necessary for courtliness. "You smell of pine and stubbornness," she said. "You smell of ink and effort," he said. "How many petitions today?" 30, she said. "A third about chickens. I prefer chickens to banners." "Everyone does," he said. They went into the council where the business of the world continued to have a taste like barley. Honest, a little dull, necessary. Gendry had sent word that he required masons and had enough food to trade for them. The Dornish Treaty had already solved 2 arguments that otherwise would have become feuds. Davos had secured a schedule with the bank that looked like a staircase one could climb without tripping over one's own feet. Tyrion had devised a tax that annoyed everyone equally and therefore must be fair. A guild of chandlers had petitioned to be allowed to set their own prices. Sansa had written a note in the margin of the petition that read simply no, and the council laughed when Tyrion read it aloud because sometimes the world offers you the gift of a simple answer. "What of Jaime?" Daenerys asked, turning a sheet with her careful hands. "He writes," Brienne's message had said. "He builds. He has learned how to stand very still while a horse leans its weight into him. He smiles at children and does not try to make them like him. He will not marry. He says he has already done it poorly once, in effect if not in fact. Let him," Daenerys said. "There is too much marrying in this city anyway. There were troubles. There were always troubles." A fever ran through 2 wards in late summer, and the healers set up tents near the river with sheets that fluttered like flags, and the city learned again the shape of fear. Daenerys went to the tents with her sleeves rolled and listened instead of speaking. Jon carried water until his arms shook and then carried more. Grey Worm stood at the gates and turned away men who were not sick and did it without making them feel like criminals. The fever learned it could not conquer and went away to find a city where it could. After, there were candles on windowsills for boys and girls who had not survived, and the city counted its losses and did not decide to pretend they had not happened. The bells were rung one evening at dusk with no announcement. 5 slow peals that told the air this was what sorrow sounded like when it was public and not ashamed. An autumn storm tore the roof off a warehouse like a careless god, and a ship went down near the mouth of the Blackwater with a cargo of olive oil that turned the water slick for a week. A rumor bloomed that the dragon had knocked the ship from the sky. Tyrion wrote a short, vicious poem about people who did not understand boats, and the rumor died of being laughed at. Some men still wanted spectacle instead of law. A group that called itself the Host of Justice painted slogans on the walls at night in a hand that would have been graceful if it had not been so violent. They asked for trials of old enemies and the return of the kinds of punishments that made markets empty. They ambushed a Lannister clerk one night and left him in an alley with his fingers broken. The next morning, the city woke up angry. Jon took down one of their slogans with his own hands and then went with Grey Worm to the quarter they were said to inhabit. They found a meeting where 8 men argued like rooster brothers about the correct angle at which to hold a banner. Arya was in the rafters, bored out of her mind, and fell onto the leader like a saint dropping from the ceiling of a painted September. The men were taken. They were tried. They were made to work in the places they had harmed. No songs were written. For once, no one minded. Daenerys wrote to the Rock herself when she learned of Cersei's death, though there was no point to letters to the dead. She did it because doing it arranged her feeling into a shape she could carry without cutting herself. When Tyrion returned from the funeral rites, he did not drink for a fortnight and then drank exactly enough to speak his grief without turning it into theater. He and Jon stood on the terrace where an old lemon tree had been coaxed into giving fruit again and talked about mothers and debts and what it means to forgive someone who will never ask for it. "It feels like dropping a stone you've been carrying in your pocket since childhood," Tyrion said. "Your step changes, and you realize you had learned to walk crooked." "You sound like Arya," Jon said. "I am rarely complimented like that," Tyrion said, and smiled without barbs. The years did not ask permission to pass. Some men who had been boys when the bells rang grew heavy with ale and contentment, and wives who loved them and wives who did not. Some women who had waited at windows learned to close them and open doors. Children who had been carried on hips learned to carry water balanced on their heads with the easy grace of the city-bred. The dragon grew wise about winds. He learned the updrafts over the new canals. He learned the smell of ripe wheat and of the wild thyme that Warden Sansa had sent from the north as a gift that made every stew taste more like the earth. He learned to ignore men who pointed bows out of habit because he had been told to, and he learned to not ignore men who looked too long at the palace roof. Once, in a winter where the air had an iron taste and breath hung like flags, a pack of wolves came down as far as the King's Road's southern mile markers. Lean, hungry, mad with a cold that was not weather but sickness. Ghost found them before they found anything else that breathed. Jon rode with him, and when the men saw the white wolf run at the front of a gray river, they cheered without knowing what they were cheering for. The wolves were turned back to the country that had made them. Later, a letter came from Sansa asking whether the men who had cheered had understood what they were cheering for, and Jon wrote back, Not exactly, and it did not matter. On a day of soft rain that made the city smell like a garden, Arya came to the yard with a pack on her back and a glint in her eye like a coin in a well and said, "Now." They had all known it would come, the day she would stop coming and going and simply go. She ate bread with raisins and made faces. She hugged Sansa with the ferocity of a wolf who knows her pack and hates to part with it. She kissed Jon's cheek and left a wet print, and Ghost licked her fingers and made a sound that was not a whine and not a growl and exactly love. She bowed to Daenerys, which made half the yard gasp for reasons of etiquette and half for reasons of heart, and Daenerys bowed back because she had learned, finally, that to bow is not to diminish but to recognize. "Bring me a shell from where there are none," Daenerys said. "I'll bring you a story," Arya said. "You'll hate it and you'll be glad." She left on a ship painted a robin's egg blue, and the city stood on its toes to watch her vanish into the scrim of rain and distance. Jon stood until his neck hurt and then stood longer. He imagined her walking on a foreign quay where the language made different shapes in the mouth and where the bread smelled like a new idea. He smiled because he could not help it. He went back to the council and signed a writ for tiles for the baths in the Street of Silk, and listened to a man explain why his neighbor's pig was a menace to polite society, and watched Daenerys listen as if both were matters of equal weight, which in that hour they were. The North sent down barrels of ice one summer so hot even the stones sweated, and men put chunks of it in their cups and laughed at wealth they could drink. Sansa sent a note with the barrels that said simply, "I recommend portioning." Tyrion took the smallest piece and stretched it with a pitcher of wine to serve 50 and claimed it as a miracle of administration. Children pressed their tongues to the cold and squealed. Grey Worm held a piece in his palm until it disappeared and looked, for one small and unguarded heartbeat, like a boy on a riverbank where a future had run past him once and left him colder. There were births and there were deaths that were not violent, and the city learned the rhythm of mourning that is not panic. There was a wedding in the yard where a baker married a glassblower, and the dragon made a pass overhead that blew the bride's veil into the air like a strange bird, and everyone laughed, and someone said it was a blessing, though no one could say by whom. There was a funeral where a woman who had cleaned the council chamber for 20 years was carried on a board she had scrubbed, and people set their hands on it as it went by and spoke her name as if signing it to the air. The bells did what bells do, and no one was told what they meant. They knew. One evening, as the light made a path of gold on the water so gaudy even the gulls seemed embarrassed, Daenerys and Jon walked the wall without speaking. The city below them was every city that had ever been, and none of them because it was itself first. They stopped at the North Tower where Ivy had been coaxed up from a tub because some small boy had told a guardsman that walls are too sad without green. Daenerys leaned her elbows on the stone and looked at nothing, which is to say at everything. "I thought I wanted to make a new world," she said softly. "I think I wanted to be new in the world. Those are not the same desire." "You are new," Jon said. "So is the world, where you have touched it." "It is not mine," she said. "It is itself. I am allowed to live in it." She turned to him. "That is more mercy than most queens are given." He did not tell her that she had given it to herself. She would not have believed him, and it would have made her proud in the wrong way. He took her hand and set it, very briefly, against his mouth, a small animal gesture, awkward and honest. She laughed, that laugh that made people in the yard look up and grin without knowing why, and then she grew serious, but not with the old sharpness. "We will be hated again," she said, "for something or everything. We will be praised beyond deserving. We will choose the wrong petition to grant and the right tyrant to deny, and the accounts will not always tally." "Yes," he said. "Will you keep building?" "Yes," he said, and did not say, "Even when I am tired of being a builder, even when my hands want other work, even when I see in my mind a hill with sheep and a woman who does not need to be rescued, even when Ghost lies with his head on my foot and I am tempted to stay there forever." He did not say these things because keeping them unsaid made it easier to keep his feet moving. Alas, trouble found them, as troubles do not like to leave a ledger unbalanced. A band O. F. Sells words, too late to any war to profit and too early to any harvest to eat, came up out of the Dornish hills with the idea that King's Landing might be forced to buy peace from them at sword's point. They had no standard worth the name and a captain with a voice that broke when he tried to make speeches. They raided a village within sight of the road and took 2 girls to make the road listen. It was the sort of thing history does not dignify with a name, a petty cruelty with everything in it, a test of whether the hard-won softness would hold. Jon rode out with Grey Worm and 200 men who had been trained to stand like a wall and move like water. He did not take the dragon. He did not take trumpets. He took food and rope and a smith's hammer he did not know he would need. They found the sellswords in a grove of olives, the ground pocked with roots like old knuckles. The men looked hungry and embarrassed, which is a bad combination. Jon spoke first because he had learned that speaking first often turns a battle into something else. You can leave your weapons on the ground and go to the river camps where there is stew, or you can point them at men who have not done you harm and find out how quickly you can die. We will take the girls now. We will bind your captain because the law will want to look at his face. We will not hang all of you for his voice. The captain tried to make a speech, failed. His men looked at him the way dogs look at an owner who has asked them to explain bread. Grey Worm raised his hand a fraction. The Unsullied shifted like a hand opening, and that was all it took. The sellswords put down their weapons one by one with the defeated tenderness of men returning stolen tools. The girls were carried out on a board hastily deconstructed from a cart. They were alive and held their own hands like sisters, which they were not. Jon took the captain's hands with rope and then, when the rope bit too hard, loosened it by a notch, a kindness that made the captain's eyes fill with rage, and then tears because mercy is difficult to bear when a man has forgotten what it feels like. They brought them back to the city and the law did its work. The captain was tried and condemned to labor on the roads until his back learned the lesson his mouth had not. The men were put to ditch digging. No one was hanged. There were grumbles. There are always men who want to see bodies dangling like argument enders. The grumbles were smaller than they would have been 2 years before. The roads were better the following spring. The dragon circled high over the olive grove a week later, only once, as if inspecting the place where his riders had chosen to be less than he was. He folded his wings and climbed into the blue until he was a thought and then a dot and then he was the sky again. When the first snow fell that winter, and it did, a thin, bewildered veil over a city that had never learned to expect it. The children ran into it with their mouths open and shouted that the North had sent a gift. Jon stood in the yard and let flakes land on his lashes and melt. Ghost cavorted like a pup and made fools of men who thought dignity could stand up to joy. Daenerys came out with her arms bare and held her hands up as if expecting coins. "It tastes like nothing," she said. "It tastes like cold," he said. She turned her palms and caught flakes on the warm skin. "It tastes like what mercy felt like the first day we tried it," she said. "Barely there, easily lost. Enough." He laughed and kissed the snow off her knuckles and then off her mouth because the city had learned to allow its builders a few foolishnesses. Behind them, the bells rang, not for warning, not for war, not for mourning. They rang because a child had been born in a house with a new roof, because an old man had woken without pain, because a baker had oversugared the loaves and the line around the corner was laughing at itself, because a wolf had lain down at the foot of a queen and dreamt without twitching. They listened. They went back inside to the work. They kept going.